going to try to talk through everything the same order that we just did it in lecture. We kind of went through the same thing 3 times. So on this model, we have a fetus, which you can see sort of the legs up here, and we have a placenta. So this entire thing right here is the placenta. This structure that should be attached to the fetus is the umbilical cord. I won't tag the vessels here, but on most of these models, you can probably find an arrow drawn on the red and the blue vessels showing the direction of blood flow. So the red oxygen-rich vessel is taking the blood from the placenta into the umbilical cord and will go to the fetus. And the fetus is taking deoxygenated blood or mixed blood and putting it back into the placenta. So you can see that blue arrow here. If you look at the umbilical cord cut open, not that little plastic thing in the center, that's just part of the model, but there are 2 blue dots and there is 1 red dot. The red dot is supposed to be the umbilical vein, and the 2 blue dots are supposed to be umbilical arteries. Those are the 3 major vessels that you find inside of the umbilical cord. So we talked about how the umbilical vein takes oxygen-rich blood from the mom and the placenta through the umbilical cord and then connects to the fetus. Unfortunately, most of our models are somewhat damaged, but this umbilical cord should connect at the fetus's umbilicus or umbilicus, commonly called the belly button. The umbilical vein will enter the fetus and it will take blood towards the fetus's heart, but as it goes in that direction, it is going to go by the fetus's liver. A lot of our models have the paint rubbed off it, but there is a vessel here. It looks black on the model, but that should have red covering it. That's still the umbilical vein. When you get to the edge of the liver, which this is part of the liver that they show there, the name of that vessel changes. This red vessel, if I tag it along sort of the side of the liver here, that is the ductus venosus. Ductus venosus. The ductus venosus, we said, connects to the fetus's inferior vena cava. The main place where you can see the inferior vena cava is on the other part of the model here. This big blue vessel bringing blood up towards the fetus's heart from the legs and the pelvis. That's the inferior vena cava. On this piece of the model, if I turn it over, you can see that blue vessel there. That's the continuation of the inferior vena cava. So the ductus venosus dumps its oxygen-rich blood into the inferior vena cava, and now the blood in the lecture notes was purple. It was mixed. The inferior vena cava will deliver that mixed blood into the fetus's right atrium. And this is where we have 2 options to bypass the fetus's lungs. The first option is to send blood directly from the right atrium over to the left atrium. That can happen because there's a hole in the interatrial septum called the foramen ovale. Because it's hard to see and it would be hard to get a tag in there, the models typically have this piece of string looping through that hole, showing that the right atrium and the left atrium are connected. So I may ask you, name the opening through which the string passes. It passes through the foramen ovale. The second option is for the blood to go from the right atrium down into the right ventricle. The blood would get pumped out of the right ventricle and go into the pulmonary trunk. And then there's a connection between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. That connection is a vessel called the ductus arteriosus. And when blood goes from the pulmonary trunk into the ductus arteriosus, bless you, and into the aorta, that would be the second way that we bypass the fetus's lungs. Then we looked at the mixed blood going down the aorta. So this would be the descending thoracic aorta. We can see a little bit of it here. It goes through the diaphragm, and then it becomes the abdominal aorta. And this is where things become a little bit more challenging to see. That's why I zoomed in the lecture notes. The abdominal aorta splits into 2 common iliac arteries, and And then your common iliac arteries, if we follow the blood, will split into internal and external iliac arteries. They are almost impossible to tag, let alone see. So the next thing I'm going to show you are these two purple vessels. These are supposed to be umbilical arteries. And there's a good chance if I tag one, I will ask you to name it first. So this would be an umbilical artery. And the second question would be, what is this a direct branch off of? I won't tag them directly, but you need to know the umbilical arteries are branches off of the internal iliac arteries, which are down inside the fetus's pelvis. Okay, so that's how I would ask you about internal iliac arteries. The umbilical arteries enter the umbilical cord and take that blood back to the placenta for the mom to get rid of the wastes that are present in that blood. A couple of the changes that I could use this model for, even though you can't see them directly. Instead of asking you to name the opening that the string passes through, I could ask you, what does it become after birth? And the answer would be the fossa ovalis. Pointing between the pulmonary trunk and the aorta, instead of asking you to name that vessel, I could ask you, what does it become after birth? Here it's the ductus arteriosus. After birth, it is called the ligamentum arteriosum. And finally, this red vessel, on this model, it is the ductus venosus. If I ask you what it becomes after birth, it turns into the ligamentum venosum.